Welcome back to Goldmark TV. We have two very different people to talk about today. In just a minute, I'm going to be taking a look at the work and the life of David Jones, and in particular his copper engravings for The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But first, we're going to have a look at the wonderful square platters of Jean-Nicolas Gérard in advance of our exhibition of his work later this month. I hope you enjoy the two things today. As we start to get to grips with a huge number of pots in our upcoming Jean-Nicolas Gérard exhibition, we've been very hard at work putting together the catalogue for that show, getting familiar with all of these wonderful pots. I thought we'd take the opportunity to look at a particular form in Jean-Nicolas pottery, which really encapsulates everything about his way of working with clay and with slip. That's these wonderful square dishes that you can see around me. Now, in Jean-Nicolas pottery, they range from the very smallest pots, like this little lovely slab dish here, right up to some of the very largest pots that he can make. You might see behind me one of the largest square dishes here. The French term for traditional slipware, the kind of slipware that Jean-Nicolas makes and is inspired by, is called terre vernissée, glazed earth. It's a very simple, lyrical, poetic way of defining pottery, of reducing it to the two core elements that Jean-Nicolas is looking to animate in his pottery. The wonderful rich clay that looks in Jean-Nicolas pottery almost as if it's been dug straight from the fields around his house in Valensole in the south of France. And vernissée, the glaze, the slip, the wonderful, colourful, decorative surfaces that Jean-Nicolas manages to get in his pots. These large square dishes are probably among the most simple in terms of how they're put together. They are simply platters of clay, large sheets that have been sort of crimped and folded. You can see the indentations of Jean-Nicolas' fingers and thumbs in the sides of them, with 4 square feet on the underside. That means that some of these larger ones, like this one here and this other one beside me, they can be hung on a wall from a wire affixed to the back of them, and then taken down, put on a table and used during a meal for the serving of food. That kind of gets to the heart of what Jean-Nicolas' pottery is about, the way that it can kind of operate as a wonderful, enriching work of art, but also utterly functional, something that can immediately come from the wall into use, into that kind of intimate environment of the kitchen or the dining room. Having a large flat surface, as you do in these square dishes, really gives Jean-Nicolas the greatest breadth, the greatest space to work his wonderful decorative techniques. It's very tempting when you see him working, splashing slip across the surface of one of these platters, or scratching through it with a very humble tool, a rusty tipped spoon, to scratch these wonderful marks. It's very tempting to compare the work that he's doing with someone like Jackson Pollock, the kind of action painters of the 1950s and 60s. That kind of abandon to the material, the piece of clay almost like a kind of a stage, an arena, a theatre where the theatrical display of Jean-Nicolas' decoration can take place. There is something very artistic, very sculptural about them. If you look at the way that the sort of scratched marks have been used across the surface, the space that they take up, there's a wonderful freedom to them, a wonderful sort of filling that space. Very reminiscent of the artists that Jean-Nicolas especially likes, people like Matisse, Picasso, Bonnard. The wonderful colour and the simple line you can really see in these pots. I think, though, there is also a reflection of the world around him, of the countryside that he lives in, of the kind of weathered surfaces of the soil that's been tilled, of the vines across the landscape, of the lavender fields that are so familiar, so famous around the area in Valensole. You can see that in something like this lovely little dish. These sort of abstract lines and spots are almost a sort of perfect mimic for the lines of vines across the countryside, and these splashes of colour, almost like the lilac blooms, the grapevines sort of coming into their into fruit, into flower. Unlike a lot of that world of action painting of that American art in the mid-century, there's nothing of the same kind of pretense about what Jean-Nicolas does, though. There's nothing of the kind of ego that a lot of those painters had. If you look at this wonderful large platter here, there's something wonderfully rustic and immediate about it, and that's something that Jean-Nicolas is always looking for in his pottery. One of the things that he especially likes to say about pots, and he is not someone who takes a lot of time to explain and theorize about pottery. He's very much a making man, someone who thinks as much with his hands as with his head. But one of the things that he often says about his pottery is that he is looking very carefully for the accidents, the things that he didn't think were going to happen, the things that weren't anticipated when he started making. You can see a lot of that in the way that the slip has been applied to a big platter like this. The way that the thickness isn't uniform, it's not even. You've got this wonderful thicker surface here and a large splash that's been made across this surface. But here, where it's thinner, you can start to see some of that earth, some of that clay coming through. It's a sort of almost a milky, transparent surface here. And even on some of these edges, you can see there's a layering of two different glazes here, the yellow and the black. Even on some of these surfaces, you can see the wonderful raw clay peering out. And if you were to turn this dish around, you'd see the wonderful, rich red colours of that clay, unglazed. I think in a wonderful dish like that, you get that whole encapsulation of the world around him, of the countryside, of southern French heat and richness, and the wonderful fertility of the land around him. But also a sense that a human being has put this together, has left his mark in the wonderful finger and thumb prints around the side of the clay. The fact that these, they have a very sort of human scale, even in these very large pots. There is something wonderfully intimate and personal and sensitive about them, which is what I think Jean-Nicolas is always looking to get. One of the things that really drew Jean-Nicolas to slipware, this kind of the school, the tradition of slipware in which he's working and from which he's always drawing inspiration, was the fact that traditional French slipware has a very simple palette. It's a very simple way of making pots. You have a clay to make your pots, a clay to make your slip, and then cobalt, copper, iron, a few metals to get your different colours. It's a kind of palette that is completely complementary. You can put these colours together in almost any combination and they work. There's something about these large platters, though, that really brings out certain colours. Some of the yellows in it that have a particular golden quality to them, or as I particularly like, this wonderful black, this almost thunderous colour. It's got a real kind of a heat to it. It's almost like a sort of hot Provençal night, especially on this wonderful platter with this large area of yellow beneath it, which is almost like a kind of landscape. One of the sort of the large, rigorous hills around Valençol, with this wonderful, deep, almost velvety black. You can see some more of those colours here in this wonderful square platter. The sort of the deep browns, the sort of gold colours that makes with this yellow slip. These are really the rich, sunny, vibrant colours of the southern French countryside, of the southern French environment. They seem to sort of bypass any kind of emotional filter. They sort of go right to the core of your brain and plug into that place that makes people feel happy and joyous. There's a real sense of liveliness and life that they bring to people who see these pots. And I think that's why he's remained such a popular potter, not just with our customers, but with us who have lived with and worked with his pots for a number of years now. We'll be highlighting lots more of Jean-Nicolas' pottery in the weeks to come. I'm really looking forward to seeing this exhibition up. We've got an awful lot of pots to get through, to sort through, before we can start setting the shelves, the displays up here, But rest assured, when we do, we'll be doing a wonderful walkthrough, and we'll look at some of these other forms in more detail too. I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of these wonderful square platters, these dishes. Do look out on our website, more will be appearing there over the weeks. But if you've seen anything you like today, do please get in touch. pots@goldmarkart.com, and we'd be very happy to help you with anything you'd like. From the vigorous lines of those Jean-Nicolas Gérard platters, we're going to be looking at lines of a completely different kind right now. If you look at this drawing over my shoulder, quite naive and childlike, spontaneous in the way that it's got this lovely drunken figure down with his glass held askance in his hand. You might not think that this was the work of a modernist artist, of an artist who really broke ground in the work that he produced throughout the 20th century. But if you know the work of David Jones, a picture like this is unmistakable. Like William Blake before him, and like very few figures in the world of art and the world of British art, David Jones is an artist who is really entirely unpigeonholable. He is one of those figures who lent his fantastic talents to a number of different mediums. He's probably best known today not just as a painter of watercolours and a letterist, but also as a writer of two of the most important works in British writing of the last 100 years, in Parenthesis and the Anathemata. Today we're going to have a look at a couple of the things from early in his career, as his time as a wood engraver, but most importantly at his engravings, his copper engravings to illustrate the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. They were thought by Douglas Cleverden, who commissioned them and published them and printed them several times throughout David Jones' life, to be the very best prints, the very best images that he made in his engraved work. So I'm looking forward to showing you those in a minute. If you don't know the work and the life of David Jones, it's a quite remarkable one. He was born to parents in Kent, though his father was Welsh, and it was only really when he came to Wales later in his life that he would see the real blossoming, the real burgeoning of his innate artistic talents. He was one of many young artists to be caught up in the First World War, and the First World War would become the major event of David Jones' life. He was shipped over in 1915. He tried to apply to a number of different brigades, even tried to get into a cavalry regiment, but found that he had no talent for horses and so was passed on until he eventually got his place in the Welsh Fusiliers. He was shipped over to Europe in 1915 and he saw conflict, not just ordinary trench wear, but the massacre at Manet's Wood, where he was shot through the thigh. He remained, after his convalescence, in the army. He was posted to a number of different places. He actually ended up in Ireland for a time towards the end of the war. But the events of the war, the camaraderie of the men around him, of the privates and the officers, the sheer change in atmosphere and environment would prove completely revolutionary in terms of the way he thought about the world. It was an event that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And many of the things that he enjoyed about the First World War, the sense of brethren, of companionship, many of these things would stick with him for the rest of his life, as would the very literal wound and the emotional wounds that he suffered watching some of the extraordinary events that he witnessed on the front line. After the First World War is really when David Jones' artistic career lifted off. He'd studied at the Camberwell School of Art, but it was when in 1921 that he came to Eric Gill's community in Ditchling in Sussex that his work took on a completely different flavour. Eric Gill, along with the other craftsmen stationed there at Ditchling, was a devoutly Roman Catholic, and he introduced David Jones to the world of Catholicism. A Catholicism not just of the church, of the chapel there in Ditchling in Sussex, where the craftsmen would break from their work to go and pray, but also the church of the workshop, the sort of sacramentalism of the tools, of the rhythms of working as an artisanal craftsman and an artist, that combined with the rituals, the very sort of ritualized life as a Roman Catholic in the Dominican Brotherhood there that Gill helped set up. Gill was a famous wood engraver, letterist, typographer and sculptor, and he was really one of the early and lifelong mentors of David Jones, alongside people like Hilary Pepler, who had helped set up Ditchling. And in fact, in this first engraving, this little wood engraving, you can see that David Jones has made. This is a portrait of himself and Hilary Pepler on a horse. You can see Pepler, the older man here, actually with his quill that he's holding in his hand along here, and a little flag up here, and David Jones himself has his engraver's tool here. Wood engraving had a long tradition in Britain. The sort of the particular feel of the white line in the black block is very, you can pin it down to a number of different artists, and it had a particular feel in David Jones' hand. Under his tutelage with Eric Gill, who was far cleaner in both the way that he worked, in the way that he kept his workshop, but also in the lines, in the images that he made, David Jones brought to wood engraving a kind of an introspection, a kind of spiritual symbolism, one that he'd nursed from those times in the war. He was a very introspective kind of person, one who lived almost his entire life in loneliness, despite the fact that in this early period of his life he was attached to the kind of communities like Ditchling and the comradeship of his fellow soldiers in the First World War. You can see some of the strangeness, some of that poetic sensibility in the way that he's made scenes like this crucifixion scene with these strange, almost sort of Shakespearean, beastly transformations going on around him. At Ditchling, he was also introduced to the Gill family at large, and it was here that he fell in love with Gill's daughter, Petra. This is a portrait of her in wood. They were engaged briefly, but as with much of David Jones' life, he found a tug between the strings of his heart, the women that he inevitably fell in love with, and the art, the work, the poetry that filled his head. Before long, despite the engagement, it looked clear that he and Petra were not going to be married. And when in 1924 Eric Gill and Hilary Pepler finally came at loggerheads, when the Brotherhood at Ditchling had broken down and Eric Gill took his family off to Capelefin, David Jones watched Petra leave. It was a hugely emotional moment of his life, one of a number of introspective breakdowns which would occur throughout his life. But he followed the Gills, saw Petra married to another artist, Dennis Tegetmeier, and instead, among the Welsh Black Mountains at Capelefin, in the new community that Eric Gill had produced there, found a completely new, fresh voice in the world of wood engraving. The engravings that David Jones produced to illustrate the Rime of the Ancient Mariner came after his time at Capelefin. It was a time when he started to break away from Gill, when he was visiting the community, but when he was starting to work in a voice of his own. He'd also, if you look through the engravings that he'd made, many of them featuring the typical biblical scenes that you might expect, but also scenes that drew on the workmanship around him, of friars working at abbeys, of people in workshops, the kind of workaday images that sort of lent themselves to the rituals and rhythms of religious life and of work life in these two communities of Gills. You can also see among his prints a number that deal with storms, with ships at sea, and with the sea and the depths as a kind of a religious metaphor. You can see that rather beautifully in this. the waters encompass me. The actual series for The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was first commissioned by Douglas Cleverden in 1927. Now, Cleverden was a publisher, a bookseller. Later in his life, he had a very fruitful career at the BBC as a producer. But he came to Jones as a young man and was one of the key figures in helping publish much of David Jones' early work. In fact, he would publish and republish David Jones' work throughout his life. You can see here I've got this rather wonderful catalogue of David Jones' engravings in wood and in copper that Cleverden put together, with a portrait of the young Jones there, rather shy as he was throughout his life, with that bowl haircut that was unmistakably his in his early life. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was a wonderful text for Jones to take on, arguably Coleridge's most important work, and a transhistorical one. That idea of passing through time, of things that were as relevant today as they were years ago, was something that really held on to David Jones. His experiences in the war, in his own writings, he would relate to those of Roman soldiers in the Roman Empire thousands of years ago. It was something that lay in his head for a long time and was obviously relevant to his thoughts as a Roman Catholic, who having converted in 1921. Jones produced 8 large engravings and 2 small engravings to go with Coleridge's text for Cleverden. And though he was by now a very proficient, highly proficient wood engraver, he'd actually made very few prints in copper. And once he'd made these, would make very few after. In fact, these were some of the last engravings in any medium that he made in his life. You can see one of the few copper engravings that he made here next to me, a rather lovely nativity scene. But it was the text of the Ancient Mariner that really beguiled Jones. The way that it sort of took those themes of loneliness, of guilt and of sin, of redemption, the sort of things that stuck with him throughout his life. They were critical to this text, core to it, and they're critical too to the images that he made. Unsure of his abilities in copper engraving, he made sure, as he said in later years, that his lines were simple, that the cross-hatching was minimal, and that he instead had a very strong sense of the composition. This is the first image in the series. It's the Ancient Mariner approaching one of the wedding guests here to tell his story, the story of the albatross that he killed and the voyage home that he took. And typical of Jones, it's not quite as you would expect if you've ever read the poem. You can tell that the emotional burden of having seen his engagement to Petra fall apart, of having watched her be married off to another fellow artist, despite staying amicable with her, staying friends with her, has obviously stuck with him. And you can see he's spent rather a lot of time thinking about the details of this wedding night that's playing out here. One of the things that you will see repeated throughout this series, one of the very simple things that David Jones took to make this such a successful series of illustrations, is the horizon line in every print is never horizontal with the plane of the plate. It's always askant, it's always askew. There's always a sense of tumult and of chaos. It's the kind of technique that you might see a filmmaker make by tilting their camera to the side. There's a sense of unease in lots of these images, of things moving and swirling, of the kind of chaotic scenes that the poem describes, as the Ancient Mariner makes this dreadful mistake of shooting down the albatross that's led his fellow sailors out of tricky waters in the Antarctic. This was such a successful series, not when it was first produced, but with time, with appreciation, that Cleverden reissued it a number of times with David Jones. It was printed a number of different times on different papers and different editions. This is made on this rather lovely, slightly green paper, which complements the sort of the green background tone that David Jones asked to be applied to these plates. And you can see in the quite simple lyrical images here that Jones has got to the real heart of the story. And there's some very obvious symbolisms going on here. The mariner with his arms outspread, and the burden of the albatross hung about his neck, as his fellow sailors begin to wither and die, thanks to the curse that's been put on them. Jones was a hugely intellectual and thoughtful man. He would often take a subject and go away and swat up on it and try and imbibe as much as he could about whatever he was dealing with. So typically, this took a long time to come to fruition. It was nearly 2 years in the making, and I think Douglas Cleverden was a little anxious that it would be published before he lose money on the prospect of the series. Among the many things that David Jones did, he went and studied rigging and ships to try and get a sense of the real life of what it would have been like to live on a ship out at sea, as the mariner did. The sense of rocking motion, and also that time spent in the army, spent in the ships sent over in 1915, trying to draw on all of those senses of experience in making these quite profound images. Like many great illustrators, and quite different in fact from those who had previously worked with the rhyme, people like Gustave Doré and William Strang, Jones's illustrations are a sort of abstraction. They're not quite, they don't easily map onto the text. They are more a kind of companion to the words, to the kind of the tumbling story that comes out of this mariner and the tumbling composition of these prints. But what they capture in the way that they've been expressed, in the sort of the lack of dated of clothing, the kind of sort of semi-realism to some of the ships, they have that kind of universal feel to them. Jones has captured that trans-historical feeling that the poem has, that trans-historical power that it has, and which he would discover in his own writing in the years to come as he penned In Parenthesis and the Anathemata, the two major poetic works which would see him compared by T.S. Eliot to the likes of W.H. Auden, James Joyce and Ezra Pound. After the year spent at Capelivine, after the time with Eric Gill, after The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, David Jones would spend much of the rest of his life in isolation, moving from bedsit to bedsit. He seemed incapable of staying comfortable with companions or in a single home. Much of that bedsit living that he'd taken from the First World War stuck with him for the rest of his life. These prints would be a hugely personal venture for him, and I think they meant an awful lot to him. When Douglas Cleverden in the early 1960s suggested that he might pen a foreword to the engravings, expecting an essay of 1,000 or 1,500 words, instead he received a 5,000 word draft which turned into a 16,000 word manuscript on the power and the prominence of Coleridge's poetry and what they meant to Jones himself. That was the kind of dedication, the kind of introspection, the kind of self-isolation that he was used to, and which would characterise much of his later work as a wonderful letterist and watercolourist too. These were among the last engravings that he ever made. He used to complain of bad eyesight, and this was one of the reasons he gave for giving it up in his later years. Really what you've seen here is merely the tip of the iceberg. He made a large number of wood engravings, and we have quite a comprehensive stock here at the gallery. So do please go and take a look on our website to see more of the wonderful work that he made and the wonderful work that's catalogued in this beautiful Douglas Cleverden book. Jones's is a career that really can't be pinned down like others to other schools, and despite the influence of people like Eric Gill, he really carries a voice of his own in the 20th century. It's work that is strange and a little unusual, and which has taken people time to come to terms with. But it's one that has seen huge appreciation in recent years, and I think the legacy of David Jones has only yet to grow more. I hope you've enjoyed this very brief look into his life. Do please go and explore his writings, explore his prints on our website. And I hope you enjoyed too seeing some of those wonderful pots by Jean-Nicolas Gérard. We've got plenty more for you in store next week. I hope to see you again soon.